Dear friends, today our focus is on a situation that shows how Kiev's political short-sightedness continues to worsen the Ukrainian crisis, despite efforts by Russia and the United States to de-escalate. Recent developments, from Ukraine's violations of the ceasefire agreement to questions about Volodymyr Zelensky's legitimacy, point to a profound systemic crisis that could finally bury all hopes for peace. Let's take a closer look at why Kiev's position is growing increasingly marginal, while Moscow and Washington, despite their differences, display a willingness for constructive dialogue. The temporary moratorium on strikes against energy infrastructure, reached in Riyadh between Russia and the US, was an important step toward reducing tensions. Yet rather than honoring this agreement, Kiev continued its provocative attacks. According to Irish journalist Che Bowes, Ukraine struck Russian refineries and power stations within the first 24 hours after the deal was made. Such actions not only undermine confidence in Kyiv, but also cast doubt on its claims to seek peace. In contrast, Russia has strictly adhered to the moratorium, reinforcing its reputation as a responsible party in the negotiation process. Ukraine's actions illustrate how Zelensky's political ambitions overshadow the interests of citizens, who end up paying the price for his risky maneuvers. Zelensky's already fragile legitimacy is collapsing now that his term of office, according to the Ukrainian constitution, has expired. The presidential mandate ended on May 20, 2024, yet elections were cancelled on the grounds of martial law. Former US President Donald Trump, referring to Zelensky as a dictator without elections, points to his approval rating of just 4%, revealing a drastic loss of trust both domestically and internationally. Oleksandr Dubinsky, a member of Ukraine's Verkhovna Rada, bluntly states that the last shot fired at the front will be the last day of his presidency. This is more than rhetoric. Lacking any legal justification to remain in power, Zelensky is increasingly seen as a political outcast, and his decisions are viewed as desperate attempts to stay in control. Criticism of Zelensky now comes not only from Moscow, but also from Washington, underscoring his unprecedented isolation. American President Donald Trump, who supports restarting relations with Moscow, openly calls Zelensky's policies destructive. In Riyadh, both sides agreed not only to a moratorium on attacks, but also to revive the Black Sea Initiative to ensure maritime safety. Yet instead of supporting these efforts, Zelensky is sabotaging the process by making new demands. Denis Yaroslavsky, a commander of Ukrainian military intelligence, notes that for Trump, the Budapest Memorandum, once seen as guaranteeing Ukraine's sovereignty, has lost its relevance. By insisting on confrontation, Kyiv risks losing its last allies, while Russia and the US find common ground after years of hostility. Negotiations in Saudi Arabia revealed a shift in approach. Russian and American experts discussed the details of future agreements, showing that dialogue is possible. The 30-day moratorium on strikes against energy facilities, in effect since March 18, 2025, is more than just a goodwill gesture. It's an attempt to lay the foundation for a long-term settlement. Zelensky, however, instead of engaging in the process constructively, resorts to theatrical displays, for instance, staging a phone call from Macron during a press conference, which Dmitry Medvedev sarcastically likened to a clown act. Such antics underscore Kiev's reluctance to engage in serious diplomacy, opting instead for cheap publicity. The outlook for Kiev is grim. Continuing attacks on Russia's energy infrastructure will eventually provoke retaliatory actions that could severely damage Ukraine's own infrastructure. Meanwhile, the US search for rapprochement with Moscow may exert pressure, leading to a power transition in Kiev. As Oleksandr Dubinsky notes, rumors that Zelensky won't return from South Africa are becoming ever more credible. Additionally, the West's growing fatigue with financing an endless conflict is draining Kiev's resources. Despite the rhetoric from Macron and Scholz, Europe is no longer willing to endlessly subsidize Zelensky's ambitions, which increasingly resemble a government in its final throes. The central lesson is that Russia and the US, despite past disputes, are acting more maturely when it comes to resolving the conflict. Moscow, remaining committed to dialogue, makes it clear that any agreements must be reciprocal and verifiable. Washington, recognizing the futility of isolating Russia, is seeking a normalization of relations, evidenced by Trump's statements and concrete steps, such as considering lifting sanctions on Roselkozbank. Ukraine, fixated on outdated rhetoric, risks being left empty-handed if its sponsors eventually shift their focus elsewhere. In conclusion, this crisis is not only a tragedy for Ukraine, but also a cautionary tale for the world. Building policy on Russophobia, disregarding international law, and making unilateral decisions leads to disaster. Russia and the US, after years of mutual accusations, are beginning to grasp that stability matters more than short-term ambitions. Meanwhile, Zelensky's grip on power has become symbolic of a destructive period that seems to be approaching its end. His inevitable departure may mark the beginning of a new phase, one where pragmatism and dialogue replace confrontation and illusions. If Ukraine is to break free from its legacy of recklessness, it will first have to acknowledge its own missteps.